Greetings, and welcome to Air Crash Investigation, General Aviation Edition, the show that dives into grisly incidents in general aviation. Tonight, we will be looking at the crash of a Beechcraft Bonanza V-35C, which ran into unknown wires along their low approach path. All 3 passengers and pilots were killed.
The aircraft involved was the Beechcraft V-35 Bonanza. The crash happened 7.5 miles east of Barstow Daggett Airport, California. The aircraft struck unlit communication lines on a VFR approach. There were 3 fatalities, and there were 3 pilots on board at the time of the accident. The captain of the Bonanza, Phil Hendricks, 51 years old, had 2,160 hours, and he was the pilot flying the final leg of the flight. The co-pilot at the time of the accident, Carol Hardings, had flown one of the previous legs from Seattle to San Jose earlier that day. The third pilot on board, David Burns, 39 years old, flew the flight about a week previously.
The crew were returning to California's Barstow Daggett Airport from San Jose on a business trip. They flew the 2-hour-long leg at 13,000 feet for 2 hours, with oxygen, towards the Basel intersection and Victor Airway 3904. From this, they would descend to 5,000 feet and fly the Daggett VOR approach with the vector given by ATC. The weather at the airport was deteriorating and was already reporting 400-foot ceilings at 2.5 miles visibility. However, the minimum descent altitude was 1,243 feet AGL. Phil wasn't bothered because local pilots had already built an under-the-table approach.
This jerry-rigged approach was pretty simple and relatively safe. When done well, it was very safe. The Midstream pilots would fly the VOR-22 approach once to keep the FAA happy, miss it, then cancel IFR on the way back to the VOR. They would descend, passing Daggett VOR on 060 until they could make ground contact with the I-15 directly under them. After making contact, a 180-degree turn at 350 feet over the interstate would lead them back to the airport for a safe landing on runway 22. Unknown to the I-15 Scud Run pilots, the U.S. military had installed a new transmission line between the Marine Corps Training Center and the Goldstone Deep Space Tracking Station. This construction was unannounced, and anyone who read about it on the bulletin board at the airport only found out about it a few hours before the Corps of Engineers strung up the 8 wires across the I-15, 7.5 miles east of Barstow Daggett Airport. Phil, Carol, and David had no way of knowing about the wire's construction, as their departure time was 2 days before the bulletin's posting, and no NOTAM was filed. Phil flew the Bonanza perfectly across the VOR at 5,000 feet, turned to a heading of 223 and descended to 3,500. They reached the MDA and MAP at nearly the same instant, and they declared the miss.
Over the VOR at 5, turning to 223 down to 3.5.
Check, Phil. Make sure you call Barstow. Phil.
Halfway to the VOR, Phil canceled IFR and told the controller they would maintain VFR as they had just broken out under the local ceilings. The controller almost laughed, fully aware of Phil's intention to make the I-15 Scud Run on the familiar 060 heading.
Barstow Tower, November 9er 2 Whiskey Tango. Looks like we just broke out under the ceiling and we'd like to cancel IFR into Barstow Daggett.
And November 9er 2 Whiskey Tango, I'm going to cancel your IFR approach into Barstow Daggett. We'll be expecting you soon for your visual approach inbound for the field. Ha! I guess they're doing the I-15 approach. Ha! 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 Ha!
Phil brought the Bonanza at 2400 and broke out of the overcast. Carol confirmed the high below them, and Phil turned left to 220 for the field.
Oh, Phil, I see the I-15.
Check that.
That means we're on the right track. We're going to be there anytime soon.
Heading back 220.
Checked, Phil.
At the 10-mile point, Carol picked up the mic, quickly dialed 123.0, the Unicon frequency at the airport, and announced that the Bonanza was 10 miles straight in for runway 22.
Okay, Phil, I'm going to call Barstow traffic and let them know what's happening on our microphone here. Barstow area traffic, be advised, Beech Bonanza, November 9er 2 Whiskey Tango, currently 10 to the east at 2,300 feet, inbound for straight-in final for runway 22, expecting the field in 5 minutes, November 9er 2 Whiskey Tango.
Woo!
We're going to be there soon, Phil.
Unfortunately for Phil, Carol, and David, they were in the perfect position to encounter the wires. At 100 knots, it happened quickly. Looked like the wings were cleanly cut, tumbling the aircraft down to the ground where the 3 pilots on board were killed instantly. Killed because they were just too good at that old I-15 approach.
Phil, what's up there?
They look like towers.
I think they are towers. No!
There isn't any excuse at all for what happened in Barstow Daggett that night. The pilot was technically responsible to visually avoid all objects and obstruction in his flight path. That's what VFR means, visual flight rules. But let's get real. How can you avoid something you can't see and shouldn't be expected to see? That's the first excuse. The second excuse is more complicated. It has to do with who has jurisdiction over ground and air rights within airport environments. In most cases, you're dealing with multiple levels of government, states, countries, cities, towns, villages, and whistle stops. And most of these don't give two hoots about the local airport and the daredevil pilots who don't dare enough about their own lives anyways. You get the idea. So how do you, or should I say, how do we deal with it? We try to get as much room as we can around and hope and pray for some intelligent consideration, which isn't always the case with the other guys. Taking the situation at Barstow, our rules say nobody can build anything that obstructs the published approach to an airport without first obtaining FAA approval. The same thing goes for the 5-mile radius around the airport. We can limit the height of anything, but that's as much as we're able to wrangle from the brilliant politicos who run the states and cities and so forth. Outside the radius, they can build anything they want to, skyscrapers if they can raise the money. And our only recourse is to beg for a reasonable judgment and reasonable notice, which technically they don't have to give us. For most of us, do with them. The Marine Corps in this case. They told us about the electrical transmission installation several months before they started it. They weren't required to do so, but someone must have realized the installation could affect the airport, so they sent us a detailed notice as a courtesy, also reminding us of their jurisdictional rights. But they didn't give us any start or completion dates, probably because those hadn't been finalized. When construction was actually started several months later, whoever had thought to tell us about it up front may not have been there anymore. We'll never know if that was the case, but for whatever reason, we were not informed until the day they strung those wires, which obviously didn't give us nearly enough time to spot the proper warnings or prepare the NOTAMs. Especially since the notice came in by mail and sat on somebody's desk for a while because the person was away. So sad. But by the time the envelope was looked at, 5 or 6 days had gone by, emergency action was taken, and everyone in our system was notified by phone, fax, and teletype. But it was too late for the people who had tried the approach that night. They found out about the wires the hard way. The one thing that was kicked around here was how it could have been that not one soul from the airport had ever saw any work being done on those towers, the 200-foot towers that hold the wires. They would have stuck out like sore thumbs in that wide-open desert area and being a clinched spot from any aircraft. Everyone who was interviewed at the airport pleaded ignorance. Apparently because the weather had been so clear for so long that none of the local pilots had used the highway approach to land, and other pilots departing or arriving from over there wouldn't have paid much attention to it. They probably assumed that the airport must have known about it. Going back to the first issue, visual flight rules, and what a pilot should be expected to see. The regulations make no distinction. The pilot is required to see and avoid everything, moving or stationary, big or little, easy to see or hard to see. It doesn't matter, but that's silly. It ignores the realities of human sight and reflex limitations. If you've ever experienced a bird strike, for instance, you know what I'm talking about. Birds and humans aren't built to see or or react fast enough to avoid these encounters, not at airplane speeds. High tension lines are also the same thing. In daylight, you sometimes get enough light reflection coming off those wires, you can see them from farther out. Even though it's tough to react fast enough to avoid them, unless you know where they are and what you're looking out for. At night it's impossible, even with landing lights. Try it sometime. You'll see what I mean. By the time you get a reflection or see the wires, it's too late in your history. But that rule is the rule, and it's what we're required to go by. So until somebody gets around to changing it, to make some sense out of it, we're stuck in it. We have to apply it the way it's being written. It gets a little embarrassing, though, calling it an accident, like this one, pilot error. It's about the same as calling a lightning strike an accident, a suicide. Nobody in their right mind would call it that, but that would be absurd.
It is clear this entire incident falls back on a blatant failure of communication. Although the NTSB declared the crash a result of pilot error, is that really that simple? Unfortunately, common sense can be written into paper, and when pilots lack in that department, they often pay with their lives. The real killer is, when a system breaks down, the pilot still pays. In this case, for an example, the system of communication failed, and it was Phil, Carol, and David who suffered. Unfortunately, it seems that the three pilots really had no way of being alerted to the recent Marine Corps construction of the communication lines. When the Corps alerted the FAA to the two construction plans, no start and completion dates were concluded. In the FAA's eyes, this does not make those plans contingent. The FAA simply sat on those plans because their policies dislike premature notice of construction plans. This is especially true when the structures are erected outside aerodrome zones, as was the case here. This notice was not required by the Marine Corps, but instead more of a courtesy. Yet still, the plans are not properly considered by the FAA. They stood behind their written rules. No copy was ever sent to Barstow-Daggett Airport, or even the local flight service station. Those were the people who could, and would have, made the attempt to spread the word of the changes. Had that been done, a compromise between the airport authorities and the Marine Corps could have been made. Such was not the case. Even despite all the failures in communication, more still remain. The last one lies with Barstow-Daggett Airport and its homegrown I-15 approach. That approach became a valid approach at Barstow for all intents and purposes, yet the approach was never published. Why not? Why was the I-15 approach never published? If it had been, the FAA would have had the jurisdiction over the ground and airspace required to have saved the lives of Phil, Carol, and David.
In conclusion, who can be blamed for this terrible incident? Was it Phil? The FAA? The Marines? Nobody will really know. But I will leave that decision to you